Good afternoon. My name is Evelyn Hankins, and I'm the head curator at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. I am delighted to welcome you to a conversation with artist Rachel Jones. Before we start, I'd like to remind everyone watching that ASL is provided today by Rachel McGarry and is available via Zoom. Cart captioning is provided by Carmen Cromartie and is also available across all platforms. Additionally, a caption recording of this program will be made available on our website and YouTube channel. A bit of background about Rachel and her practice. Rachel Jones is a London-based artist who over the last several years has received international acclaim for kaleidoscopically colored gestural abstract paintings that offer a deeply visceral view onto what she describes as the interiority of Black bodies and their lived experience. At once intensely personal and broadly resonant, her multi-layered, densely packed compositions are anchored by her distinctive visual language, which often features motifs including teeth or landscape, embedded amid a mesmerizing array of interlocking textures and colors that all come together to operate on both optical and phenomenological levels. Rachel received her BA in Fine Art from Glasgow School of Art and her MA in Fine Art from the Royal Academy Schools in London. Her work has been featured in a number of group exhibitions recently, including the Hayward Gallery's painting survey, Mixing It Up, Painting Today, as well as in one-person exhibitions at the Long Museum in Shanghai and the Chisendale Gallery in London. In addition, the Hirshhorn was recently gifted a major painting of Rachel's by Iris and Adam Singer. That work is currently on view at the museum in Put It This Way, Revisions of the Hirshhorn Collection, an exhibition, as you can see here, that features artworks by more than 45 female and non-gender conforming artists, and which will be up through the summer. Rachel, it is such a pleasure to welcome you today. Could I ask you to please turn your camera on? Hello.
Hi.
Thanks again for joining us today. We are delighted to have you here. Before we start, and with all of the questions, I'm wondering if you might just tell us where you're tuning in from.
I'm on holiday at the moment. So.
All right. Well, that's lovely. And thank you for taking time from your vacation to join us. If we could start with the first slide, why don't we just jump in right away? And as a bit of background, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your earlier work. Have you always been drawn to painting? And if so, what is it about that medium that really resonates with you?
I mean, when I was a child, I was more interested in drawing than anything because I was really into cartoons and comics, and I would spend a lot of time copying things and like coloring in. And all throughout my education, life drawing has been something that I've done continuously, and it was necessary as part of my experience studying at Glasgow School of Art for 2 years. Like, you had to do life drawing every Monday. But then after that, it was a voluntary basis, which you would sign up to classes. And I continued that throughout my 3 years there. And then also when I was at the Royal Academy, I would go to life drawing. And before, when I had a studio on my own, I would find classes to draw. So that really informed how I look at things, which then influenced how I paint. And the idea of using color was something that I associated with painting for a long time. Like, I didn't draw in color, and I didn't really think about color when I was making drawings. And so when I finally started to think about what it might mean for color to come into the drawings that I did, and what I was interested in my painting practice, which was abstraction, like how did that correlate to my drawing practice? Everything started to converge into one thing. And so I started to work with oil pastels in the paintings that I made instead of oil paints. And there was just a lot more interconnectedness between everything. So instead of compartmentalizing, like, this is what I do when I draw and this is what I do when I make a painting, they all suddenly started to speak to one another in a way that they hadn't before. And so I look at this work now as painting, but really it stems from a drawing practice. And I talk about them in a way where I describe them as like things that I color in. So there's like a back and forth between those two forms of making.
Right. And we'll touch on some of those subjects later. But one of the things we talked about earlier about outline and how outline kind of comes and goes from your work. And I think now hearing you talk about it in that way, it makes a lot more sense to me. Yeah. So these, we spoke about these were created when you were in residence at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas. I know many artists, including painters, that have been really productive or have had their practices really shift when they were at Chinati. So could you talk a little bit about what it was like to spend time in rural West Texas and how it impacted your work?
Yeah, I had the best time. It was a very transformative experience. I think I needed some kind of hiatus because I went 2 weeks after I graduated from the Royal Academy of Art, and it was like a very intense 3 years. And I wanted to take a step back from, being in such a kind of like frantic work environment. I felt like I needed to be somewhere a little bit more removed from what it is to like be in a city where everything is very social and you have access to so many things. I wanted to maybe look inwards instead of looking out all the time and like seeking things outside of myself. I wanted to be a bit more reflective and introspective. So that's why I wanted to go on a residency. And I thought it'd be good to have something to kind of, shift my perspective on the way that I make as well, because everything for me personally, everything that I make is influenced by the environment that I'm in. And I thought there's nothing more extreme than going to a really barren and kind of desolate space to make work in. And I thought that's what it would be. But in actual fact, there's a lot of activity and life in the desert, but it's just very different to what I was used to. And it really shifted my thinking about the way I make in terms of how I fit into like an ecosystem. Like when I was in the desert, I was just like, I am not the most important thing here. In fact, I'm very vulnerable here and I have to fit into an order that is pre-existing and is actually, it's very, grand in its scale and magnitude in terms of how it impacts me. And so it was a very humbling experience. And while I was there, I ended up making a lot of small paintings, which was partly a practical thing, but also a response to how I wanted to honor, like being a person that was coming into this space and wanting to respect and think about what it means to be making work in an environment that basically nature rules, and it doesn't need any sort of additional input from anyone. Like it exists on its own perfectly fine. And I wanted to see what it meant to be making things in that space as opposed to the one I'd been in for 3 years, which was like school and lots of discussion and interacting with loads of other people. Like I was at the residency by myself, spent a lot of time by myself. There was actually no pressure to make anything while I was there. As soon as I got there, they're like, you can just swim, you can read, like, you don't have to do anything. Like, this is your time. Like, you can use it how you want. So from the outset, I had like a very open kind of like outlook on what I could do with my time. And yeah, it just gave me a new lease of life. And I ended up making things that I don't think I could have made anywhere else. And one of the things I was in awe of was seeing how Donald Judd had basically devoted entire buildings for singular artworks. Like that's something I'd never seen before. I mean, I've been to Deer Beacon, but even there, like there are lots of things in this huge space. And so the idea of like the way you show work and permanent housing of works and like the idea of people visiting things as some sort of pilgrimage, it made me think more about the way I install my paintings, and I played around with that in a way that I hadn't before. So the show that I did at the end of the residency was the first time I started to place things on the floor, or hiding things behind doors or under windows, or I made like a huge vinyl sticker of one of the paintings. So I really played with the idea of like what it means to make a painting and present a painting. And that's stuff that I hadn't really considered in any sort of way prior to that experience. So it was very important, I think, in lots of different ways.
Well, it sounds like, because a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about later seem to have a lot of their origins there. And what I love is not only how Judd's, way of showing artists impacted the way you show work, but his practice is all about giving in tremendous amounts of space to artists, like, you know, those two giant sheds where he shows his work, or John Chamberlain. And I love that you went very, very small. There's something about that. Like, you know, there wasn't for you, it wasn't the impulse to fill the space, or, you know, to create work that kind of was enormous.
About like the sky, like, I don't know, that there's something about the desert, it's just like endless. And I was kind of overwhelmed and in awe, and I was just like, there's no way I can compete with that. And I don't want to, nor do I need to. And everything suddenly seemed to make more sense in terms of making things that slot into the vastness and are like maybe keyholes into the vastness. And that wasn't something I'd done before. And I really don't, well, it's better now, but at the time I didn't like making small paintings because I find them really hard to do. Like, making a large painting is very easy for me. So it was a real challenge, and I only had 2 months, and I was like, I'm going to do a show. So to make a show of small paintings within that period of time was like quite a big challenge for me, but it pushed me in ways that I needed. And like you said, like the idea of how do I respond to the history of this space, and, you know, these male artists whose work are very grand and kind of fixed and like solid and gregarious in a certain way. It's like, what do I want to say to that? Like, because I'm in conversation with these things as well. So yeah. Oh, Evelyn's disappeared.
While we wait for Evelyn, perhaps you want to talk about this work.
Yeah, okay.
Transition piece in some ways.
So this was a follow-up from the things that I'd made while I was on the residency. So I kind of brought everything home with me, and I got a studio, and I had this space that was kind of, well, just mine, which is very different to being at school where you're around people all the time. And I slowly started to make things, and eventually I ended up working on like a much larger scale than I'd ever done before. And the ideas that I'd started to develop in the smaller paintings of having individual teeth fill up the entire surface area with like a bit of landscape in the background, that was something I wanted to push further. So I started to think more about the space that the teeth were situated in, or that the mouth was situated in, and blurring the lines between what is solid and what is mass and matter, and what is more slippery and fluid. And the idea of movement in the works became very important. And that's something that slowly I feel like I've started to interact with in ways that are very different to the example that we have in this work. Like, something that instinctively I'm always kind of trying to like think about is how I use space and how much information I put into an image, and where the patterning exists and where the layers are really built up, and maybe where there's more emptiness, or there's like a space for the eye to rest. And this is the first attempt, I would say, on a large scale where I was thinking about all of those things whilst also addressing the idea of there being a mouth, or like some kind of like figurative or natural form amongst all of that. So yeah, this is something I made quite soon after that experience, and it was part of a body of work that I also was making for my show, which was at Thaddaeus Ropac. I was in a group exhibition, and I was making work for that, and another exhibition I was doing in a small gallery. So this was the first body of work that I made after the Chinati Foundation, where there was a real shift in the visual language, and I was really trying to focus on making something that was quite distinct and kind of express some of the ideas I'd started to think about in Texas, but wanted to really kind of develop in like a whole series. So
that's great. And sorry about that technical difficulty. Only happens with live online programs. So thank you to my colleague, Amy, for jumping in and asking a question.
I was going to be like, well, I'm in charge. So we'll just, have a little chit chat. Everybody put some questions in the chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you. If we could move to the next one, that would be awesome. The next image. So I love how you talked about the transition to to the larger work. And I am not a painter, and a lot of people I know are not painters. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about what it was, aside from that kind of intertwining of drawing and painting that you talked about earlier, that drove you to oil pastel and oil stick on canvas. Like, what was it, the palette as well? Or is it really just because, I'm assuming because they're sticks, they're just much more like drawing than painting with a brush. It's a direct drawing experience. Is that what it was?
Exactly. Yeah. There's something about like the immediacy of like picking up a color and putting it on the canvas or putting it on paper, and the consistency of the pastel, like the way you can work with it is interesting. Like some of them are very solid, some of them are a little bit more translucent. But the thing that was really appealing is that they don't require any mixing. I mean, I actually really enjoyed that part of painting, like mixing colors and spending time really like making your own colors. Like that's really fun and like quite challenging. But with the pastels, there was this step that I didn't have to kind of to do. And then following on from that, it meant I could paint at a quicker pace because I wasn't waiting for things to dry. So I was being a lot more efficient and rapid in the way that I thought. And the flow that I could get into with making the work, it wasn't interrupted by like drying times or waiting for things to like really settle. And I think the most kind of appealing thing about working with the pastels and oil sticks is just the color, like the vibrancy and like the tactileness and the stickiness. And yeah, it's just really satisfying to work with. And when you use them, if you work in layers, they don't muddy and merge in a way that's like kind of gross or just
there's no brown, like it doesn't all muddle into brown when you start mixing.
Yeah, like everything sits in its own territory, right. And they do interact, but in a way that is really exciting. It's not, one doesn't like diminish the other, which is really good. So.
Right. And I think what you were talking about, that immediacy, you don't make sketches, do you? Your work always kind of develops on the canvas as it goes. Yeah. It's very improvisationally, like kind of in the tradition of like the abstract expressionists. And so then the question is, how many of your paintings get thrown out because that's so improvisational?
Oh, okay. So nothing gets thrown away because I feel like it's a waste to just, disregard a work because you don't like it. Like, some of the paintings are actually things that have been painted over several times, not in time. So when I start a painting, I always finish it within a set period of time. So I have a wall, like I'll staple the unstretched canvas to the wall and I'll just work on something until it's finished. But some of the paintings are painted on top of older paintings that have oil paint underneath because I never throw anything away. So I will keep paintings from like years ago in the studio that I won't throw away because eventually I'll get around to just painting over them. And I think it's nice to have those types of works because there's a certain depth to them. And the way I work is in layers. So before I make an image or think about like where teeth might be, I do a colored ground. So there is no white visible whatsoever on the surface. So it's just like loads of random colors. And in this painting, for example, the blue section at the bottom, that's ground. And in the middle towards the top, the yellow and the green, that's ground. So there will always be a colored ground of lots of colors. And then I work on top of that. So having older paintings is actually quite nice because there's all this like material and there's always substance to them already. And then I just like go on top of it and it just adds a certain amount of substance to the image. So.
And that I would just say is so much more clear when you look at the painting in person. Like you get as I always say, you get your nose up in the painting, like the, photos, well, they show the colors and the palettes and the brightness of your work. You don't get the kind of detail in that texture because the painting that we'll look at in a few minutes from the Hirshhorn's collection does that as well. And when I first saw it in the galleries, I mean, it was stunning, the difference in effect. So if we could look at the next slide, please. These are two installation shots, and I wanted to use them because you have described in the past color as a form of looking, and you talk a lot about the body as being a vessel for feeling the painting, and that you really want it to be a visual experience of your painting rather than one that's just, visual or intellectual. And your use of scale is really amplifies that kind of phenomenological nature of your work, because as we've seen, I mean, there aren't dimensions on here, but I think the photo from the Long Museum shows the scale goes from enormous and monumental to really small. So could you talk a little bit about scale? And then also, you talked about how Chinati gave you that opportunity to kind of think differently about installation, but how you work in a space. So when you have a show plan, do you make paintings and know how you're going to install them, or do you get in there and then just start going at it? Like that's.
Yeah, I think with this thing about scale, like I started like making small things, like I explained earlier, because I had certain limitations around like what I had available to me in Texas and like what I could bring home. And it was a bit of a challenge for me to work in a way that I wasn't comfortable with, that I wanted. But then when I came back to London, I realized that there's a different relationship between the small paintings and the big ones. Like, first of all, the physical nature, like that you're mentioning to them, is like there's a lot more intimacy, and the way you go up to a small painting and the experience of looking is very different to the larger works. Like with the larger paintings, you tend to move around a little bit more, or there's the idea of your body, in your entire body encountering this image and it being a space that you enter with your body as opposed to your eyes leading the looking. And those kind of two viewing experiences were really interesting to me, and how I kind of pushed the ideas of, well, what is the difference between a larger and a small painting, and how can I show the smaller paintings in ways that are different, and how can I show the larger paintings alongside them? So the idea of like the height that I hang things at became really important, and wanting to play around with the stickers and making kind of things that mimic the paintings, but texturally like they're very flat, and the way that you place them on the floor kind of moves into territory that discusses like the rarefication of painting or the commodification of painting, or what do we relate to painting, or the correct way of thinking about painting or installing a painting or caring for paintings. Like all of these sorts of things came in. So stuff that was quite formal, but actually was linked to very emotional and personal responses to the experience of looking at a painting. And I always make things sites so that they're site specific. So before I start working on a show, I'll get images of the space if I can't visit it, but normally I'll go and I'll walk around, I'll have a look, and then I'll spend time in my mind thinking about the number of paintings that I want to make and where things will go. And then I start making work. So I won't have an idea of the types of images that I'm going to make, but I'll know roughly like where I want things to go. And I tend to follow that quite closely. When it comes to the install, because I know what I want to do, that gives me a foundation to work from. And things might change, but more often than not, like it's exactly as I envision it.
It's amazing.
Yeah, like that's something like learning to be confident about being a little bit more forceful with the types of positions you present to people about their own relationship to painting or their understanding about painting, because, you know, people are often very resistant to the idea of hanging a painting at a certain height. Like it's like, oh no, that's too low or that's too high. And it's like, well, why is it? And what does it mean for somebody of a certain height to be able to look at the painting if it's really low, or for someone not to be able to see the painting or to look down on the painting? Like, how does that alter the viewing experience? And so those are the sort of things that I was interested in.
So I want to touch back. You mentioned something about kind of thinking a little bit about the commodification of paintings, and do the reason in a lot of your earlier works, not all of them, some of them are stretched, as you can see, but is not stretching them and having the irregular edges something that aligns with that, kind of, because it becomes again something that's not as much of a precious object because it looks a little, for lack of a better word, unfinished or tattered, even though it is. I mean, no, I'm not. You know, is that commodification something that you're thinking about with doing that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's nice to have like different ways of making the paintings. Like when you have a rectangular or square frame, like subconsciously, like I will only make certain types of images within those parameters, because it's like this is what you're used to, this is what you're taught to work within from being a child in primary school. But when you have wonky edges or curved lines and things are like stapled flat to a wall, and that's the way you're working, there is like a shift, and I can't explain it, but the types of like paintings that I come up with, they tend to be very different to the ones I'll create when the paintings are stretched. And there's a little bit more, I just think, of a fluid response to the way the work will kind of be produced, or the way it will be shown. And it's nice for me to have like different relationships to the ways that I paint, and for not everything to be like really familiar and habitual. Like I want to push myself, I want to be surprised, I want to challenge other people's ideas of the way you should make a painting or the way a painting needs to be displayed. And, you know, stapling a painting to a wall the way I do in the studio in an exhibition, like there's a correlation between the practice of making and the experience of looking and showing. Like there's a similarity.
Right.
The going back and forth towards a painting when you're looking and something is accessible, like to scale, is the same way that I go back and forth when I'm in the studio. So the paintings basically when they're hung are very similar to the height they are when I'm making them. And so that's why I'm so comfortable with them being that way, because it's like that's how they look to me all the time. And those sorts of things, I want there to be a real sense of like the physicality of a body engaging with an object and not trying to create a distance or create a formalism around that. Like we can think about that formalism, but it's not the most important thing.
Right. Well, I mean, I think about someone like Sam Gilliam, who did the same thing with the bevels, where he made the edges, like the relationship between the painting and the wall. He heightened that kind of consciousness when you're standing in the space between something that's coming off of the wall, even just a little bit because of the stretcher bars, and something that's pinned or tacked to the wall.
Exactly.
Again, it's all about the kind of cultural expectations of what we expect. So I just want to show the next slide, which I love, because it shows both kind of the surprise that you might find when you encounter one of your paintings on the floor, but also like how the bodily experience is so different than when you think of someone standing in front of a wall. It's great. And so, and, you know, as a museum, though, we have 1 million people a year who come to the Hirshhorn, and we're always talking about, you know, I don't think we could ever put a painting on the floor without some kind of barriers or stanchions around it.
Like, this is most people's worst nightmare. And when it comes to like installing things, I was like, this is a sticker. So really, if people stood on it or walked over it, then, you know, it wouldn't be a problem. But I did originally want to put a painting on the floor, and they were like, well, if you do that, then the likelihood is it will get destroyed. So I was like, okay, well, maybe we won't do that. But even that, it's like, if I'm okay with the work to be ruined or destroyed, then, you know, that's fine. So it asks questions of myself. It's like, well, what is the longevity of a work? Like, do I want it to be something that lasts beyond this moment? Or do I just want people to be able to experience it in this present time, and then whatever happens after, it doesn't matter? Like some of the paintings that are on paper, the surface isn't primed. So when you work with oil pastel, if you don't create like a barrier of like protection between the surface and the pastel, eventually the pastel will erode the surface. So it's like some of the paintings I've made, like they won't last for time immemorial. And it's like, you know, what does that mean? And like for there to be those kinds of realities, like the pastel itself, like it's always very tacky, like it doesn't ever dry properly. So there's an aliveness to the work. And, you know, I think all of those things are important. And I purposely don't frame things because I want the works to exist in the space and not be contained. And again, like that presents a problem to people when they think about, well, how do we look after this outside of the context of a show? Because it's very fragile and vulnerable if it's just exposed to like dust or like the environment, or someone can just touch it or rip it. And it's like all of these things are really interesting to me, because it highlights, well, what is like most important when you're thinking about art? Is it the way we live with it and look at it, or the way we preserve it, and the history of like continuing people's ability to be able to like look at things beyond a specific moment in time? And yeah, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I'm just like trying to make things that pose these questions and like problematize them a little.
Well, yeah, and museums we're just trying to keep up with the artists, honestly, because it is our job to preserve them. So I feel like as a team, the museum, the conservators and the registrars and the curators are always having these conversations with the artists, like, well, what if and what if? So I mean, I think it's great. I will say I'm glad that's a sticker and not a painting. So we can have the next slide, please. This is the painting in the Hirshhorn's collection, as I said. What I'd like to talk about here is there is a long historical lineage and really significant cultural expectations, which I think are fading in the last decade or so, but the Black artists would work in a figurative style. And you've managed to develop this practice where the work, I would just say, leans very abstract. The figurative references tend to converge around a few subjects: teeth, the mouth, foliage, landscape. But they really require time to emerge or even to decipher. So the narrative is eluded. We were talking earlier about how I didn't see the teeth in this painting the first time I looked at it. It was on my phone. So, it's not that I'm an awful looker. But I would love for you to talk a little bit about your subject matter and your choice of the mouth and teeth as a subject matter, and how you kind of deal with cultural references as you kind of teeter back and forth between representation and abstraction. That's a lot, I know.
Yeah, no, but I think like one of the things that we spoke about before was how when I started making paintings of teeth, there wasn't this really kind of grand expectation for it to address multiple things. It was just a really simple way of using a symbol for the body, but thinking about it in a way that allowed me to explore what happens outside of a body and what happens inside. So the idea of like an interior landscape, and then what lives outside of that and then feeds into the interior, and like vice versa. And so one of the things when I first started making the paintings after Texas was trying to blur the line between when you're looking into something or when you're looking out from something. And that was kind of the focus of trying to place people in a position where they were within a landscape and they weren't quite sure what landscape it was, and for it to be a colored landscape, for it to be patterned, for it to be focused on movement, but for all of those things to be attached to emotions or like generating emotion and a response that is like felt and also physical, like the idea of like moving your body back and forth when you're looking at the painting. And through the process of making the works, I was able to understand that there are lots of different access points for people to think about the content, because I was talking about my lived experience, my interior. And then when you think about what teeth mean in a historical or racial context, there are like lots of different avenues to go down. And then when you bring culture into that as well, there are even more things you can think about. And when you consider class, or when you consider literature and the way people write about teeth, or the relationship between teeth and health, or teeth and psychology, and teeth and dreams, or teeth and the idea of like adornment and decoration, or fetishization or repulsion. Like there are all these things that can be kind of attached to the ideas in the work, or attached to someone's own personal experience of looking at the work, but they fundamentally they aren't necessary as a way of looking or like understanding or feeling connected to the painting, because there are so many different things happening, or I want hopefully for lots of different things to be happening. So if you don't see teeth in the image, like you still are able to like respond to the work, and it's the color that does that, or it's the sense of discomfort or like discordance, or even I don't know, like a slight sense of familiarity and the idea of like forms and patterns and being able to recognize things, and a questioning of, well, why do I see these things, or like why don't I see certain things. And the titles also are used as a way to help guide people in a direction where they might understand that some of the things in the painting are referencing a body or an action or a performance or a portrayal of something, and the idea of sound and expression and like hearing or looking and listening, like all of these very sensory activities, like those are the sorts of things that I want to kind of put as like a foundation for experiencing the work. And then from that, the more time you spend thinking about things and the context that the paintings exist in, there are like lots of different things you can learn or like question or consider as well.
No, and it makes sense. And I think the mouth, especially as that point where the interior and the exterior are just constantly in, in tension or meeting each other. And for this painting, you were talking about noticing different things. To my mind, it is such an active painting, but whenever I walk through the galleries, I find myself drawn to that passage of lilac and lavender that just kind of like draws you off to the side, and I have been from when I first saw it. And I try to ponder why, because, it's very easy to get lost in like, the color and the textures and the patterning, but it's that kind of feeling of being taken away by the lilac and it's that which makes the whole painting compositionally to my mind, and like without that, if it was just all patterning, it wouldn't work as a painting.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be very different. And like those areas are ground. So the red, like the
that's what I thought.
Yeah, so that's like the very base, like the beginning of the painting. And I think the more work I made, the more I wanted to think about like, where do I leave breathing space, or where is there a moment of rest or a moment of pause or quiet? And I think, to use the word quiet, like it's not inactivity, it's more that there is a different type of thinking or a different pace to the thought process that's happening, or a different method of looking and a different way of experiencing the work. So it's not that you're, just kind of not responding to the color, it's that the response is varied and the response shifts you into a different way of relating to the work or relating to the visual language of the work, and thinking about why is there space in the painting, and like if I enjoy this part so much, like what's happening elsewhere, and like why do I respond to this different? So there are like real, I suppose, like formal questions about the work, but you can respond to it in a way that's emotional. It can just be more like broad in terms of the way people engage with the painting. So it's not purely something that is intellectualized, it's something that is understood through feeling, and that's something I want to encourage, because both forms of understanding are important. So
right. I want to just go back a little bit. You were talking about quietness and reflection. And one of the things I read in an interview is how you talk about quietness and reflection as not only a mode of existence, as you mentioned, but also a form of resistance against oppression. And what I mentioned earlier to you was that I find your paintings to be exuberant, the palette and the textures. If we could look at the next slide, because it's the one counterexample that kind of proves the rule. But I'd be interested in have you talking about that idea of quietness and reflection as a form of resistance, and how it kind of aligns and influences your painting. Like I said, this is the one painting I found with a different palette.
Yeah, because I think something I'm conscious of, it's like very easy to just fill the entire surface with color and pattern, and the challenge is in knowing what space can be left with less information visually, and what spaces in the painting can be a little bit more troubling or jarring or complicated to understand or to enjoy. Because I feel like something like feedback I get about the work quite a lot is that they're really beautiful and people like to look at them, and my goal is to make unpleasant work. Like I really want to make things that are more antagonistic, and I haven't accomplished that yet. Like I've only been making these paintings for like 3 years now, so this entire way of working is like a very new thing, and it's something I'm still developing and still learning about. And I would say that the work here is kind of following on from other attempts where, like in the previous painting where there's ground, it's like the vast majority of this painting is just ground. It's like this black and this peach, like that's all ground, and so there's very little added to that. And I'm interested in like what it means for the work to move more into that territory, where the idea of, I don't want to say emptiness, but or we can say emptiness, but not as in like a lack. It's not reductive. It's like it's emptiness is like a challenge to noise, or to like it's a different type of chaos, like the idea of blankness or something that is very minimal, to me is quite like fear-inducing or like shocking or like frightful. And like those are the types of things I want to emphasize in the paintings, because they're not only like pleasurable like visual things. I want them to be quite provocative, and provocative in a way that is like moving people from a position of feeling like they understand something to a place where they're confused or they're troubled. Because I feel like when you're in that space, that's when you learn, or that's when you're pushed to think differently to the way you're used to, or that's when you're maybe shocked into realigning your understanding or your perspective on something. And this habitual like, oh yeah, like I understand, or like the idea of like familiarity it's like, well, no, that's taken away from you. And so it's like, well, what do you have instead of that then? So those are the things I want to like develop. And I certainly haven't gotten there yet. But I think when I make works like this, I'm like, yes, this is like the root of the thing I'm trying to grow and like to push. It's like making very intentional like decisions about how to like change the language of the painting so that it can enter this different phase of like emotional registers and like visual elements. So
I mean, it's like the other elements that you're doing to disrupt conventions of painting. It's all disruptive. And so now you're just using palette and space rather than using shape and scale. So it's all in there. It's just trying to figure out, I would think, as someone who does not make art, like using all of the different tools.
Exactly.
If we could look at the next slide, please. This is an installation shot of 2 shots, actually, of a show you recently had. And I love how it shows your interest in language. It features a text piece. And obviously from things like the title Smile, which requires you to go smile, like in some kind of awkward, weird way, like when people tell you to smile for a photograph. And in past interviews, you've talked about the importance of writers like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker on your writing. So could you just talk about a little bit about the relationship between sound, text, and painting and how that plays out?
Yeah, I mean, I always paint to music in the studio, so I'm always surrounded by sound and language. And I think there's a language in the painting, which is one of movement, and that is linked to the movement of sound that I hear when I'm making things. And I wanted that to be kind of felt in the work, but then I also wanted to think about the other element of like sonic language, which can be like the spoken or narrative language that is added to the idea of like notes moving or like shifts in sound. And reading things by, the writers I have mentioned in the past, and you just suggested, like, I think I was aware that you are able to paint pictures with language. So the way that you read things is, well, for me anyway, is like a dual experience of like having someone present something to you, and then you interpret that presentation in a way that generates an image in your mind. And I wanted to be able to use language in that way. So instead of it only being an indication of what's maybe happening in the painting or what the painting is about, I wanted there to be a visual or like an understanding of like a real lived action in relationship to the language. So like you said, you say the word smile in a certain way, and you understand that that exists in a context when you're asking someone to smile and they don't want to, or there's a hierarchy in a relationship where another person is demanding another person's smile, and there's this idea of like performing for another person. And it's like, who is asking who to smile, who is doing the smiling, and like this discomfort and kind of, I don't know, maybe friction or relinquish of control that you don't want to admit. But, all of these complicated and nuanced iterations of how people basically interact with one another, or the way language can make you think of those types of moments. And that's something I wanted to put more obviously in like this show, and to think about the dualism of a sentence, or the way you can kind of warp someone's idea of something or mislead someone with language, or you might be excluding certain people with language. And you talk about the hierarchies there are in language, like talking correctly or talking in a way that isn't familiar or colloquial or personal and intimate. And it's like all of these things, even with like the capitalization of everything, it's like, well, that really is, for me, like something that is like very tied to the way we text, or the way, you speak to people that you're close to or like familiar with. Like there are all these sort of subtle like, I don't know, like access like points for thinking about the work in different way, just through like something like sunshine written or smile written. And they just help, I think, add a little bit more context for the painting practice, or the things outside the painting practice that inform the way I make things.
Well, and also you've received mostly attention for the painting practice. So it's nice to see that you're kind of making sure that the other practices come in. And so I want to look at the next slide, which is this wonderful event where you organized a pro-black karaoke performance. We're running out of time because we've run over, but I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about where this was and what it was and what you were trying to accomplish with it.
Yes, I did this performance in a project space. It used to be a chicken shop in Northwest London. And this was the year of 2020. So we'd come out of like lockdowns, and I wanted to make something that was purely joyful. Like, it was the year of George Floyd, and obviously we'd been going through like what was a very like difficult and complicated time of coronavirus. And I wanted people to come together, and I wanted to highlight and emphasize the capacity for joyfulness that exists within Black communities. And I was like, the most immediate thought I had was to use music and sound for that. And I personally just love karaoke. And I think there's something about it that dismantles some of the like difficulty we have in connecting with one another, or the awkwardness we have in being in communion with one another. So I put together a set list of songs by artists that were Black or identified as Black, and I sang. And then I invited members of the public, like family, friends, whoever, to come and sing with me or do like a song by themselves. But you could only sing if you were Black or identified as Black. And it was a space that I decorated with images of Black writers, intellectuals, artists, musicians. I have friends and family, the things from nature, things that really just influenced my practice and helped me in my, like, I suppose, gathering of information. And I decorated the space with balloons and stuff, as you can see. And it was just like a real moment for us to be together, like to have fun, but also to think about some of the experiences that you have when you're looking at art, and there are things in it that you don't understand, but like speak to you. So I made like a recording of the entire night, and I had friends suggest songs that I should like put together in a playlist. So there was always sound playing, and once the performance was over, the recording of the night played on loop in this space. And so people could understand the context that there was an event that happened whilst they were looking at these images, but there was no explanation of what the pictures were, who was in them, who made them. And so there was this real emphasis on who you are, like your positionality, like what you know, that will impact the way you experience this space and what you understand. So some people came in and they knew who some of the people were in the photos, or they knew some of the writers, and some people came in and they didn't understand. But the idea was that this was a space for learning, but also experiencing things that are different or counter to your understanding of maybe everyday life. And sometimes I think when we look at artworks, we feel like if you don't get it, or if you don't understand what it is, or if someone doesn't tell you what it is, then you've missed something, or that you haven't maximized your experience of looking. And I believe that when you go somewhere to look at something, what you bring with you is enough to start to engage with an artwork. And so it's like, you don't have to know who made these paintings, and maybe if you do, it changes the way you look. But fundamentally, it's about what do all these things together make you feel, and like, how do they make you feel? Like, what is happening in these images? Like, what am I trying to depict? And like, what does it mean when you look at these things and you hear this music? And I had like a lady come in off the street from the local area, and she was just like, I don't know what any of these things are. Like, I don't really like art, but you know, it's nice to see that all the people in these pictures, just they look really like self-possessed and like they have agency. And I was just like, yes,
That's it.
Was amazing. I was just like, exactly. And I started to talk to her about who people were and like blah, 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 blah. But the fact that she was just like, I understand that, you know, this isn't something that maybe I'm meant to be part of, I'm not meant to fully grasp, but what is being presented to me is something that I can witness, and I can see that there is a portrayal of love, or of power, or of confidence, or self-expression. And I was just like, Yes, and if you use that as a way to just the idea of like looking and thinking and understanding like who you are, if you use that as like a foundation for going to view anything, and using that as like a way of understanding work, then it allows you to go into spaces and feel, I don't know, more comfortable about what art is and like what art's purpose is and how you can relate to it in a very everyday and ordinary way. And that's something that I wanted. Like I wanted to bring people together and be like, this is art, but also it's just life. And I want us to celebrate that. And so, yeah, it was the beginning of part of a process where I was working collaboratively and I was being very intentional in creating like a specific environment and a specific context for the work that was a lot more explicit in certain ways, but still coded and layered.
So just, you were kind enough to mention in our conversation a couple of weeks ago that you are working on a project with St. James Church in Piccadilly. Do you want to, can you give us a clue on that? And then I think we're going to have to close up the conversation, but I would love, and that's happening in September. No, it's been great. This is great.
Okay, yeah, I'm working with the Roberts Institute of Art. They commissioned me to make a performance. So they started this very recently. I'm the first person that they've worked with, where they offer artists who don't have a performative background but want to start exploring that as part of their practice. They give them opportunity to work on something for a year. So as soon as they invited me to do this, I said yes. And I was just like, I want to make an opera. So I'm co-writing an opera and creative directing, something. And it's going to take place at St. James's Church in Piccadilly in September. And I'm working with the composer, and we have basically everybody in place. And we're going to start rehearsals like in a couple of weeks' time. So this is like a consequence of the karaoke, and I see like a very like close relationship between the two, and it's been really exciting because painting is a very solitary practice, which I love, but I wanted to think about other ways of making work and the things that I can talk about in other mediums that I can't in painting. And yeah, working collaboratively is something I've always wanted to do. And so this is the first time I'm doing it on like such a grand scale and in a capacity that is very different to what my knowledge base is and what I'm used to and what I'm comfortable with. But like, it's meant that I've learned a lot and I've grown a lot. And I think the direction of the work has also expanded. So yeah, I'm really excited about that.
We'll document it so those of us on the other side of the Atlantic will be able to see it. And I just want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us, especially while you're on vacation. It has been such a pleasure, and I'm obviously a real fan of your work. So come to Washington, and we hope you will come see your work on view at the Hirshhorn.
Yes, I will.
And I want to thank Rachel and Carmen for their assistance with the captioning tonight or today. And I would just say everyone should come to the museum to see Rachel's painting in person because it'll be on view through the summer. And then just a reminder that the Hirshhorn's next public program will be a talk by Jerry Saltz, which will take place at the museum in person on June 22nd at 6:30 p.m. So thank you, Rachel. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.